Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Lucan. I'm a freelance writer and 1/3 of the Too Many Men podcast. And I'm just thrilled to be here with the people who I just consider icons in the space of not just women's hockey media, but women's sports media. So I'm just going to throw out some topics and let these geniuses share their insights and challenges to how we can be even better in this space going forward. And to that, Eric, I wanted to maybe have you start and set the stage for us. You cover not just women's hockey, but you cover quite a bit of women's sport. Share with us the challenges and what goes into really trying to make space in the media landscape for women's sport and women's hockey specifically.
Wow, I could spend all of the time that we have answering that question, Allison. Well, first, I would just like to echo and say hello to everyone as my mother today, Nilda Dantain. But so I think the way to answer that question is that things are growing. They are definitely changing and evolving across women's sports. But my coverage from sport to sport differs because the resources that I have are different. I know that some people really blasted me for a women's hockey story that I put out. And I'm kind of glad that they did because it made a case for all of the presentations that we saw today. It's almost impossible, especially for someone who has a legitimate fear of numbers like me, to be able to, and I also tried to push back with an editor, like, in a year where, or in the past years where we haven't had consistent tournaments, where leagues have minimal games, if any, because of that, big bad thing that Mike Murphy said earlier, a whole pandemic. It was very difficult in women's hockey to make a case for who is the best right now, because we weren't even seeing the best on the ice in the last handful of years playing against each other. So what I will say is that I'm fangirling over all of the presentations that we saw. The work that you all heard on this at this conference, is going to make the work that I do even better. But right now it is a challenge. Right now it is a challenge to get all of the data. Things are better in the WNBA, but not great. Things are different in women's soccer, but still not great. So there's a lot of work that we have to do. And I find that being a journalist, sometimes you have to advocate even in your own pieces of like, hey, well, this is the best person, but only if you tilt your head to the left while drinking a Coca-Cola on a Sunday. I mean, that's kind of how it feels sometimes.
100%. And that's a perfect lead. And I wanted to ask Marissa and Nicole specifically. Nicole is my sister, and sharing screenshots from Big Ten women's hockey games. Sometimes that's all the data we have. Nicole, maybe I'll start with you, and Marissa, you can chime in as well. What is that lack of data hindering from a media perspective in terms of the stories that you want to tell or the questions that you want to answer?
Well, I will answer that, but also just want to say, like, I tried to write a story about analytics and how it was for a streaming service, so it was all WCHA schools that were on that service, about how those teams use analytics, and none of them had an answer. So if the teams aren't using it, then it's especially hard for me to be like, okay, I'm going to go into a post game and ask a student athlete about, analytics or data. So, I mean, I'm lucky because like you, I do get those screenshots and those shot charts every time. So at least I have that and I can ask questions about shot attempts and things like that. But in terms of like digging any deeper, it's pretty difficult. And like I said, I'm lucky that we mostly get those at the schools that I'm able to go to games at. And if you start to head to other conferences, it's not necessarily the case. So for me, at least, I have it somewhat better just because I do have some of that data, but the data is pretty limited. And then obviously in the last year, we weren't getting those. So I obviously didn't have that, which in a year when we had no teams, no cross-conference games and things like that, it made it especially difficult to compare and decide like how you're going to rank teams and how teams might match up. So, heading into covering the Frozen Four or the whole NCAA tournament, I was a lot more lost than I've been in previous years.
Marissa, chime in, girl.
Yeah, I just look at like from the juxtaposition of doing like NHL work and then trying to do women's hockey work, how it's just so night and day. Like if I'm doing like an NHL story, it's so much easier to find data. Like I can just have an idea of like, oh, I want to write about how like Philip Dinal on the Canadians is like shutting down forwards. And I can just like go to Natural Stat Trick or whatever and find that data so easily. Where if I have that idea for women's hockey, I'm like, oh, I want to see like high danger chances for Michaela Grant-Mentis. I have to like hope like, oh, I hope like Mike Murphy did something, or like I hope that someone has tweeted something, because I'm not a math person. I don't really know how to track that stuff. I'm a writer, I'm a reporter. So like my from there I have to go for like, I have to hope someone did something, or look for like just harder reporting, like firsthand accounts. I have to get quotes from people that illustrate it. And that doesn't illustrate the story the way that data does sometimes. So it's just a lot harder. Like if I have an idea, I just have to do a lot more labor. I have to do a lot more work, that instead of just writing and reporting, where for NHL, I can write a story that day and it's pretty simple. And as a freelancer too, and having to pitch and sell women's hockey stories all the time, knowing I need that extra time, it doesn't make it any easier. So as more data becomes available, the easier our jobs become as writers and reporters, because we just can kind of expand on our own ideas more, and just can do ideas and different stories a lot quicker.
Gabs, some of your best work, in my opinion, that I love is you follow some of these players over years and years and years of their career, and you've been connected with some of the most foundational programs. Where do you think data could help us connect with fans through our stories? You know, we talk about this question of who's the best, or who does this player play like? Are there opportunities we're missing with connecting with fans that data could help us with, do you think, or maybe educating the fans as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think kind of as everyone else has so far echoed, like the data is so important to be able to tell these kind of like coherent stories. I think for myself and just kind of like my writing style and my strengths, like math is definitely not my thing. Like I am a features writer. I love getting to like the human side of things, I guess you could say, and really digging in. And it's enjoyable to me to be able to talk to coaches like about their players and tendencies and things like that. But I think some of that is so much more readily available when you do have the statistics, and it does help. You know, like these players aren't playing in a vacuum. So even like, for just to take that example of like writing a feature story, and, you know, I'm doing it to educate people and to kind of share those stories with the fans specifically, like it just helps so much more to kind of have that like cross conference data specifically in the NCAA. One thing in particular for myself that I am always kind of like struggling with is how we evaluate defensive players. That is like something that I think is like hugely lacking in women's hockey, I would say, especially in the NCAA, because almost all of the stats that we have are very like offensive based. And in women's hockey, of course, as like any other hockey, like the defensive side of things is super, super important too. And you tend not to have like true stay-at-home defenders, I guess, in the women's game. And so anyway, that's just like one area where I feel like the fans would definitely benefit from being able to compare like defensive players who are so great at what they do, but like just because someone doesn't score the most points in like the ECAC and they might not win like ECAC Defender of the Year, that doesn't mean that, you know, they weren't one of the absolute best players there. So yeah, just that's kind of how I see it.
Jinsey Dunn says hello. No, sorry, my personal campaign. And that leads actually, Spencer, I wanted to ask you, because you are doing so much work in this space. And, you know, Nicole mentioned not a lot of the teams that maybe some of us cover are digging into analytics. And the few times I've heard women's coaches speak about analytical concepts, they're using work that was done on the men's game. And Gabs just mentioned, you know, players play differently in women's leagues. And, you know, we saw work on faceoffs done by Alyssa and Mike and Shayna earlier this year, how it's different in the women's game. What is the risk? How are we actually maybe hindering the sport if, because we don't have as much research going on, our women's professionals are actually using research based on the men's game? What is the risk of that happening for the women's game?
I think you're looking towards it becoming more homogenous with what the men's game is. You run the risk of turning into a grinder style game that men's hockey tends to default to when they can't figure something out. You know, try and just shut down everything, whereas the women's game really has this beautiful flow to it, and creativity is really at the peak importance of a player's success. I think that in terms of the lack of research being a huge issue is where players develop differently. You know, we don't have, as much as we don't have the statistical information, we don't have a lot of the developmental information either. So how are we training these players to maximize their specific skill sets? And are we doing it based on existing norms from the men's game? Because there are such differences between the two at the top level. Are you really maximizing the talent of those players if you're not paying attention?
Fascinating. Nicole, I think mentioned this too earlier. Eric, I'll ask you, even some of these lessons we're learning, even if they are based in the men's game or in the women's game, because data isn't readily available in the women's space right now, does it affect the way that you try and communicate with players when you're doing interviews or trying to explore a play or a result of a game? How does it come into play when you're talking with players or coaches doing coverage?
Yeah, that's an interesting question for me. And I'd love to hear what others have to say, because in some ways, I'm lucky that until more recently, I only cover women's sports. So I can kind of use language that is familiar, even if it's not maybe what we might see in a broader hockey context. I'm familiar with women's hockey language. And so I usually stick to that. Now, how that translates elsewhere is where that's my learning curve, because everything that I know comes from the women's game. So for me, when I'm looking at stats, and I have this problem in the WNBA, I could go off for days, but I'll summarize it this way. The WNBA, as a lot of people know, especially in the women's hockey space, because some people want to see this model, the WNBA is underwritten by the NBA. And that means that they share stats. Where that is problematic is that the NBA plays, 48 minutes, and WNBA stats are pressed and compressed into metrics that are for 48 minutes, not for 40 minutes. So even if I was a numbers person, I know enough about the numbers and the squiggly lines and stuff to know that I can't really use that data in a way that's going to make sense if I'm hardcore analyzing a WNBA game, because that's not going to account for some of the things that a player is doing, in this case, on the court. So I know enough to know that the numbers, you can't really just squash them together, or you at least shouldn't. And I would argue that other people should know that as well. But unfortunately, we do see that in women's sports, that it's like, okay, well, yeah, it's 8 less minutes, but yeah, bam, let's just be inaccurate and hope for the best. That's kind of what the challenge, I would argue, is when it comes to using metrics that are not, and maybe it's not the men's women's divide, but if you're trying to use something that is measuring a soccer game and you use that analytic for hockey, we would never do that. That doesn't make any sense. And I feel that it's the same way, whether it's amount of players on a roster, whether it's amount of time in the actual literal game, things of that nature. The 3-point line or arc is different. All of those things matter if you're getting into advanced analytics. And so for me, again, my language comes from the women's side of things. And the reason I stay there is, one, because I can. But if I had to navigate, and again, I think some other people might be able to answer that, like, what is that like? Because it just seems like it would be a little bit of a mess. But that's the importance of, yes, hockey is hockey, but college hockey has its statistics because that's a different type of hockey. Junior has its different type of hockey. International, they're all different. And again, I know enough about numbers and physics to know that those differences make and they make a world of difference when we're trying to analyze player by player, tournament by tournament. And we have to account for those types of things.
Nicole, you mentioned this about not even being able to find teams that might be using it. Are you finding obstacles when you want to explore a concept with a coach or a player where you have to educate them, or maybe the topic or the language isn't there to explore more data-driven ideas beyond the very basic stats that we get?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there is still kind of an old school mentality. I do think it depends on what coach you're talking to. I think that they're at Ohio State, she's gonna do a lot more with it than, say, Mark Johnson is here in Madison. So one of the just interesting things is that, like, usually at a college game, you get taken down to the locker room with the SID, and the SID is holding the packet of stats, the final stat packet to hand to the coach. And like 9 times out of 10, I see players kind of running over there to look at it over his shoulder or her shoulder. So I always find that interesting, that like the players are really interested in having that, and it's not given to them during the course of the game. They don't see any of that. So I just think there does need to be sort of a systemic and mindset change in some of that stuff. I don't think that necessarily the old school coaches, or however you want to put it, are like anti it. I think they just like haven't even dipped their toe in, kind of thing, and so they don't really know where to start. So I know too, it's interesting at bigger programs, like I know, you know, like Wisconsin and Minnesota can do stuff with like heart rate, and they monitor their players on the ice and things like that you don't see at smaller schools. And I always find that interesting, and that's something they're interested in learning about, but then like not digging into other analytics. But then you also see at some of the smaller schools, then you see coaches and communications people that are more involved then, because they have to handle more stuff. So like I know that there was at St. Cloud State, there was one of the communications guys was really into it, so he was tweeting advanced analytics. So I just think it's really interesting that it's kind of hit and miss, and it's not necessarily by sort of big school, small school, like the amenities that they have available to them. But yeah, I always find it interesting when the girls immediately come out of the women immediately come out of the locker room and start looking at that shot sheet. Like they want that information. So I think that we need to say sort of a tide change in terms of like making that available to them throughout the course of the game.
Yeah, it is crazy. I see that too. And Gabs, do you see that? And also, you know, we are a conduit to fans, but we are also hearing, as Nicole says, what players are interested in, what they're pursuing, how they want to be better and make the game better. When you're talking with players and coaches, are there topics that you're hearing from the people really in the game that data might help us eventually answer or investigate, or problems that we could solve? What are you hearing when you write your stories, even if they're more narrative, of things that you think data could help us address?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Allison. And I feel like very similar to Nicole, definitely from like my experience with players as well. They are extremely focused on their statistics. Definitely not going to name any names, but it's a very common trend. And so, yeah, I think like just having more of those insights like is always going to be helpful. I guess for me, like I think like I have so much work to do myself as far as like understanding a lot of these like advanced concepts that I can't like pinpoint like a specific like interview or discussion where I've been like, oh, well, maybe it would be cool to have like advanced statistics on that, or just be able to explore it a little bit deeper. But I do think something that I noticed, and this is like kind of echoing Nicole's point about how much things differ from program to program, is that this is kind of like the nature of our sport in particular, just being so niche, and even at the college level, like there is excellent like local coverage. There are excellent people involved on like team staffs, but it does differ from team to team, and it's really hard, I guess I would say, like as a national reporter who's trying to cover like all 40 plus Division I teams, to have these like set standards to be able to look at, you know, just across the board, like, you know, and like you might know that like a certain team, you know, they have someone like Nicole saying who is like really upfront and like public about these like advanced statistics, but it's just not available for everyone. And so that is like definitely something that I see as a challenge as far as trying to cover the game, you know, as a whole, and like cover like Division I as a whole, and not just like being hyper focused on one team like I had been in the past when I was still in school.
Marissa, the minute Erica said this, I was like, oh, I'm going to ask Marissa this question. Such an important point, and we're not going to get into the philosophical debate of the NHL becoming involved in the women's game. But from a stats perspective, Erica, I love that point. Marissa, thoughts, opinions from a data perspective, if you can go there, because you use both spaces, men and women's game, the NHL getting involved with the women's game from a data perspective. Go.
It's not like the NHL's like super embraced data though either. And you know that too, Allison, like a lot of the resources are coming externally still. It's like the guys at Evolving Wild and again, Natural Stat Trick and like people like you and like all that kind of stuff. Like I don't use a ton of like advanced data like I do when I'm doing like a deep dive on a guy or like trying to make like a special point on like, oh, well, like the Lightning power play is doing X, Y, and Z. And why is that? Let's look at like the 5v5 situations or whatever. And I don't think I've ever used like the NHL resources for that because they're so limited. Like there's the NHL media website, but like it's not like there's a ton there. Like I've struggled to find like shootout data on that website. Like one time I was trying to do a story about like the Bruins all-time like shootout stuff, and it went back to like 2006, and then that doesn't help at all. So I'm not sure how much like that support would help women's hockey because it's not really helping the NHL either. Like, and there's so many people in the NHL who are so reluctant to like totally embrace that too. Like we see like what the Kraken are doing, like in that rules, and we see some other teams that are embracing it a little more. And then you have other teams who like I've talked to GMs in front offices who are like, well, we kind of look at it, but you know, like that's about it. So I'm not sure how much of a difference would make from a data perspective unless they were to invest that infrastructure into their own league as well, if that makes sense. Like, and maybe more eyeballs on it, maybe that would help. But that can happen anyways. Like there's people like you, there's people like Mike who do stuff in the men's and the women's hockey spaces already. So if the people want to do it, who have that those resources and are equipped to do that, they're going to do it already. So I'm not sure direct NHL involvement would do much of anything. Because then we have to also, not to get like too philosophical, have to believe they're going to actually like enforce infrastructure for women too. And like we can debate all day whether they would do that or not to begin with, because they have the resources to do that right now if they felt like it, and for years going now. So I'm not 100% sure it would do much of anything, but like always, like more eyeballs, I guess, more people viewing the product, like there's always that possibility, I guess.
We've kind of ripped on what we don't have. But Spencer, where are you seeing data take hold? Have you seen it advance the game or advance the storytelling that's going on? Where should we celebrate what data is helping do in the media space related to the women's game?
I think it's slow going. I think that there's definitely writers, and everyone here does a good job of trying to wrap everything in with what they need and what fans are looking for. I think that it's really getting at the attention of bigger outlets and bigger media corporations, similar to the general coverage of women's hockey. I to kind of follow up on what Nicole was saying about different NCAA coaches. It's fascinating to see some of the younger coaches really starting to embrace it, but that data still isn't public. So, is your SID interested in it? Are they involving themselves, and how are they wrapping that into their pre and post game recaps and previews? When it comes to the professional ranks, you know, the sample sizes are so small that the amount of meaningful information you can glean is relatively limited right now. So how are writers qualifying that? How are they trying to dip a toe with the reader to kind of go on that journey together? Because it's all well and good to write about it, but if nobody has any idea what the heck you're talking about, no one's going to read it. It's funny that I know that my D3 SID is watching, and I know that he's worked with me on a couple of things, and he definitely tries to pull some of this into his work. I know that there's one of the SIDs that used to work at UNH used to do it and work with me on it. It's getting there. It's not close enough, but it's getting there.
Awesome. We have a couple questions from the chat, and I'm actually going to wrap them into something I wanted everyone to chime in on. And that was, and Zoe, who presented earlier, Victory Press, support them. She shared on Twitter too. She said she's learning so much. And as a member of the media and being able to bring this work into her work is such a huge thing. And so we had some questions in the chat too. Here are the questions, and then I'll tell you all what the biggest question is for everyone that we'll wrap with. Besides one public big database of data, what do you think would all make your job easier? What is the largest barrier for the media utilizing data in their coverage of women's hockey teams? So we'll wrap with this. We'll go around our virtual room here and just share. Nicole, maybe we'll start with you, to take the next step to bring data into your work even more than you already do? What would you love to see? How could a bridge become stronger between the analytical community and the media community? What do we need to do? What resources do you need? What's your wish list to advance using data in the media space?
I mean, I think it's just, for lack of a better like term, I feel like hockey needs its sort of like Moneyball moment where like there's a big sort of buy-in, because right now I think it's, you know, I look to baseball where it has changed significantly, but you still have a bunch of mostly old white dudes that are like doing commentating and talking about how none of that matters. And so I think about that where there's plenty of younger managers and younger front offices that are using it, but we have the front facing people talking about how that's not important and it when I played the game and things like that. But I think hockey is already so far behind that. Like baseball is doing that front facing, and hockey doesn't even have like the front office type buy-in. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm talking in circles, but like the idea that there's I can name maybe like 5 coaches that I think are probably actively using this kind of data in NCAA, and there may be more, but they're certainly not talking about it. They're doing it on the down low then. And then the other thing too, I think from an NCAA standpoint is when we're talking about SIDs, like even at Wisconsin, their SID covers, I think, 3 other sports. So when you're talking about having them be part of that narrative and put it in their pregame notes or their postgame notes, like those poor people are so incredibly overworked. So the idea that in addition to all of this, that they should be able to include that, it's a difficult, I would feel bad asking for them for that, because I watch them like watching track while we're sitting at the hockey thing and also talking to students who are somewhere else. And so it can't be on them. And all of us, I think, have said like data's not our thing. Like if we were math people, we wouldn't be journalists like 90% of the time, right? Like most of us, that's not our thing, right? Like it's very like left brain, right brain. But I think there needs to be, all of us need to learn more too. And so I think it's, you know, it's hard, like Spencer was saying, like it's not where it needs to be, because we all have work to put in. The teams, the SIDs, the coaches, the journalists, like at every level, more work needs to be done. So I think that's really part of the problem, or the biggest problem, the biggest thing we sort of need to overcome. Because I think like when I go to working or looking at putting in data, I think about like, I'm talking about 40 teams that almost nobody else has watched. Like nobody else is watching 7 streams a weekend. You were talking about, you know, using data in journalism coverage, and sometimes I want to do it just because like nobody else is seeing this wide range of teams, and so I can help them understand that. But at the same time, I feel like most of the people who are reading what I'm writing don't have any understanding of even the most basic data, much less advanced analytics. So the idea of doing that when I feel like a lot of what I'm doing is still trying to get just basic fans is a really interesting give and take. And like that might be my wrong take on it, feeling like that people can't handle that, but it's a balance that I feel like I have to work on in terms of like how tactical of a piece should I be writing. You know, like if any piece only gets a couple hundred hits, like where, you know, like as Gab said, like I like telling the people stories. And so it's an interesting balance, I think, to try and find what coverage I should be giving and where I should be putting that time. We don't get a lot of space. Like we only get so many column inches, and like, how should I be using it?
Marissa, you mentioned some of the resources that you use when you write on the men's game. Is that something that would help you? Is it about, like someone suggested, one big database? What are the resources that would help you maybe bring data more into your women's hockey stories?
Yeah, just like having the access to it. Like one of the big resources I use, like visual data, is important because it makes me understand it. And I feel like it's easier to relay to the audience. So like if I'm writing about like a goalie, I like really showing like the rebound map kind of, where they show, so like I can talk about how like, oh, like he's in control of the game or whatever because he's not allowing these rebounds into the slot or whatever. So one thing during the Lake Placid bubble, having I'm blanking on the if anyone remembers the data we had from Lake Placid. Does anyone know what I'm talking about?
Stat leads.
Stat leads.
Yeah,
Just
like having that.
yeah.
So, like having that was amazing because like I think it was like Megan had the like the tweet showing like the Boston Pride passes and stuff. Like that's wild because I'm not thinking about that, and you see it, and just like having that access. Like now I'm thinking about that. Now I want to talk to like Jillian Dempsey about like what are your practices like? Like how are you like practicing those passes specifically. What are you working on in your zone entry? Sometimes I'm not thinking about that because I'm analyzing what's in front of me, or like Gab's talking about the storytelling element, like the people element of it all. But then when you have that access, when it's in front of you, you can start being like, oh, that's amazing. How do I write about this for an audience? How do I ask the right questions? Just like having that access in the NHL, like we do have to work for it compared to like in baseball where you have a little bit more of the people embracing, like you can go to the MLB website and find a war or whatever. You can't really do that with the NHL, but it is still more accessible. You have more resources at your disposal. So I just think that access for us, we can make it more accessible to audiences and readers if we just can have it in front of us.
Gabs, you talked about how you are the more narrative style. For you, would educational resources be important? What would be meaningful to you to bring this kind of work into your stories? If you wanted to, maybe you don't.
Yeah, no, I think I would love to. And this is like taking too big of a step back. And this is definitely not like a very, I guess, like sexy answer, I would say. But like just having resources to be able to even do this. Like there is like almost no investment in women's hockey media. Like I guess like infrastructure wise, like I mean, I don't, like none of us are doing this full time. I know Erica, like and Marissa too, but like you're covering so many other sports for so many different outlets. Like for me, like the biggest issue that I have is definitely I would need like the time and like being able to educate myself, like you said, Allison. And it's just like not really feasible for me at this point because it's not something that like I am able to be like compensated for in a way that like, not that it doesn't make it worth my time, but just the time isn't even there because I, have a full-time job that's completely outside of sports, and there just like isn't that like systemic, I guess, like sport-wide investment in the media and being able to, for us to be able to really like use our time and do this.
Spencer, what do you want to help strengthen this bridge between media and data in the women's game?
How much time we got?
You have 1 minute.
I think that everyone's kind of hit on it. I think central database would be great. I think that more awareness of some of the smaller creators that are doing the work at a conference like this and utilizing those resources is a good way to kind of push that boundary. But I think you're going to run into the same problem in women's hockey that you do in men's hockey, and that's severe pushback from the establishment kind of veteran leadership that tends to gatekeep the sport and are hesitant to kind of to dip their own toes into it. So I think honestly, we kind of need to be a little patient with how it develops. We don't want to overwhelm people and try to force something because that's exactly how you get it to not work. So I think really it's about identifying the people that are going to be most accepting of these kind of different takes and different ideas and ideologies, and leaning on them until they're the ones that are kind of in that position of social or political power to kind of push that into the mainstream.
Erica, final thought from you. What do you need, my girl?
Oh man, I tried to take notes because I thought I might be last, and I was like, well, this could go on for days. But there are a few things. I agree with a lot of what everyone said. From Nicole in particular, I really liked that you said that Moneyball thing. I think Megan Chaika and I were on a panel, and I mentioned that, like having a Moneyball moment, but in hockey. Because if you take that analytic approach, we're even seeing it in the WNBA now. I hate 1000% that the New York Liberty are insistent on shooting 3-pointers, because the New York Liberty, in my opinion, is not built to shoot 3-pointers. But the analytics say that shooting 3-pointers will get you to win more games. I think that could be right, but you also have to have a 3-point shooting team. So I can have that conversation because the coaches in the WNBA are already at a place where they're starting to push the needle. We're starting to play positionless basketball, something else I really don't like. So, but I can have those conversations, even though I'm not a quote unquote data person. Like that's not something that I would call myself. I really liked Spencer, what you just said about being patient, but I also want to go back to some of the work that Gabby has done, that Marissa has done, that Nicole has done, that Allison has done, that Mike in particular has done. Got to give a shout out to the stats man, because you all get me excited about numbers. And of course, Alyssa here as well. You all get me excited about numbers, thinking about bringing in someone who will, talk to Ohio State about data, and then I can have a conversation with OSU, and they're excited about it. So I get to follow the lead of everyone that has been presenting at this conference and is on this panel. The steady stat. All right, first of all, anytime I get to invoke the name Kelly Stedman, I'm just super excited. But Mike Murphy then, took what Kelly Stedman was so good at and made it into a data point that now we can talk about. Someone else mentioned the Boston Pride. I think maybe Marissa, that was you. And in stats and Stathletes, what they were doing, Stathletes in particular, I would always call the Boston Pride ferocious on the ice. And now I can have a data set. I can have a visualization to describe that exactly. You don't take the puck from the Boston Pride 1920 team and keep it for very long, because they will hound you for it. And now we have a data set to prove that. Those are the kinds of things that then will lead into me being able to write stories about an MVP argument. Everyone knows here that Mike Murphy is a sweetheart, but the one time Mike Murphy and I got into a serious argument was because he wanted a defender of the year that I thought was way too offensive and didn't actually play defense. And I was like, that person cannot be defender of the year. But it was a conversation. It's that passion that you evoke. So I saw some of the chat asking, well, how do we get people who aren't into numbers like me to follow our stories if we start using advanced stats? Those are the things. MVP arguments. Why are we pulling the goalie when that doesn't work? Why aren't more women's hockey players shooting from the outside? These are all things that we can have conversations, because everyone wants their team to win, and everyone wants to think that the way that they want their team to win is the right way. So if we start bringing that part of sports culture into the conversation, everyone, again, who presented on this conference is now giving me ammunition to say, yeah, my opinion is right. And so that's what I think I am challenging myself from today on to do more of that in the women's hockey space, because I do it other places. And now I have a bunch of good friends and more data sets. Everyone, please drop the links, because I need all of it. And I can now have a conversation and not think of what we don't have, but push the conversation to what we need more of. And so that's what I'm hoping to do.
Lesson to be learned, as we should all know, Erica is always right. All right, we are at time. Again, I can't thank everyone on this panel enough. Y'all, if you don't know these individuals here, this is the elite of the elite. These writers are who you should be reading, supporting, clicking, following. This is the upper echelon. Please support them. I know I speak for all of us on this panel when I thank Alyssa, I thank Carly, I thank Mike for this tremendous event. We are so honored to be a part. I'm truly humbled to have brought the voices of these experts to you today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Alyssa. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much for everyone being involved with this. I know it's definitely weird as someone who started in the writing space and then took a hard right turn into never writing again. It's been really nice to kind of validate a couple of year-old opinions that I've kind of had floating around since then. And, I'm really excited about the future from here. We are going to have a really short 2-minute break now, because I'm presenting next, and if I don't feed my cat, there will be a riot in the middle of my presentation. But yeah, thanks again to all of you for tuning in. It was lovely to have you.